Our next guest has a long history with this program. In fact, as long as the program itself. And he was the original producer of the Zero Hour, but he has gone on to bigger and arguably better things. Daniel Marans is a reporter with the Huffington Post. He covers political and economic developments. He's been writing a lot of great stuff lately, and there were a couple things I wanted to talk to him about, so he's come back to join us. Daniel, good to see you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Well, it's great to be here, RJ.
Well, let's jump right into it. Let's start with this. About a week ago, or maybe a little more now, there was a controversy of the kind that candidly drives me nuts in American politics. The week is, all right, I won't get ahead of myself. There was a controversy about Bernie Sanders and a coat. So maybe, and I thought you analyzed this quite well. First of all, what was the controversy?
Well, a conservative news site, the Daily Wire, did a little sleuthing and looked at the coat that Bernie Sanders was wearing on January 1st, New Year's Day, when he spoke at the swearing-in ceremony for the second term of New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. De Blasio, obviously, kind of in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, in some ways claims that he was introducing some of these same policies that really caught fire with Bernie earlier on, and he invited him to speak. Bernie was bundled up in a nice winter parka because as the temperatures have been on the East Coast for the past few weeks, it was very, very close to 0 Fahrenheit. So the folks at the Daily Wire did a little Google searching and identified the coat that Bernie was wearing as a $690 coat from the company Burton, which is kind of like a skate snowboarding company that's based in Vermont and has apparel that grew out of that kind of skating and snowboarding industry, but has really just become a very nice apparel company. And they sort of had this screaming headline of, "Haha, we caught him. The socialist is wearing a $700 coat. How could he possibly object to capitalism when he's spending all that cheddar on on some nice threads?" And it got currency. It got picked up. I mean, especially by Newsweek, which really had another screaming headline about it. And socialist Sanders wears $700 coat while denouncing the rich. Um, so this is not the first time this has come up. I think that Bernie Sanders is a big target because there are many media outlets. I mean, I think on the conservative side, there are folks that know he's extremely effective. I think in the centrist vein, there are folks that feel threatened by his message as well. And when you really have an innovative populist message like Bernie does, that's incredibly moralistic and simple, that the 1% are cheating the 99% out of their rightly earned pay and the social programs that make America function and thrive, then it kind of puts a target on your back. And the thing is, I mean, or at least in our political cultural context in America, it does. And so we've seen this before. We've seen it. Bernie, through his financial disclosures, we learn largely through book royalties, but also, when you add his book royalties to his congressional salary, he cleared $1 million in 2016. So that's not the kind of money that some people have earned through, let's say, speaking fees that might make a person beholden to
Right.
the audience that they're speaking to. So it's a very particular kind of earnings. But he started to do well for himself. And I don't think that's been true throughout his career, but that also elicited, Sturm und Drang, a hue and outcry at the time. And then going further back to August 2016, which I guess was still during the general election campaign, he took heat because his wife purchased a third home on their behalf. They have a home in Washington, D.C. They have a home in Burlington, Vermont. And here they bought a $600,000 vacation home on Lake Champlain in Vermont as well. So, these are not spectacular amounts of money, but people were trying, but people basically have been the implicit argument that people have been making is that you need to be a pauper to call out concentrated wealth and extravagant greed and the policies supported by people that have that wealth.
Yeah, I think there was even some picture of Bernie drinking Starbucks coffee or something, and they thought they'd nailed him on that. And you'd think he was kicking back
Caught
in
him
a
red-handed.
yeah, right. Yeah, literally red hand. You'd think he was sipping Cristal in a Malibu crib or something. But why isn't that? Your piece was headlined what the Bernie Sanders winter coat controversy gets wrong about socialism. What does it get wrong, in your opinion?
Right. So I started my piece by basically just getting through with the easier part of the argument, which is that progressive politicians, which include people that are not even as far left as Bernie, call out concentrated wealth and the greed of the wealthiest people in this country, not simply because, oh, wealth is bad, though I think that there is a very good case to be made that it is inherently bad in this country, but in the context of policy debates about protecting our social insurance programs and trade-offs that over handing out big checks to them in the form of tax cuts. So when Bernie says something like, "How many yachts do you need?" He says it in the context of fights to protect the Affordable Care Act and to fights against the Republican tax plan. So that's the first thing, and it could just as easily come from someone like maybe Elizabeth Warren. I mean, I don't. You don't need to have the Democratic Socialist moniker to think that the ultra rich in this country are are greedy. I mean, they are taxed at lower levels than in virtually anywhere else in the developed world, maybe except for Luxembourg, which is a tax haven, and and yet they insist that we can't afford to do all sorts of things to take care of our of middle class and low income people. So that's a very simple point. You don't need to be a Francis of Assisi living a life of asceticism to make that point. But there's a bigger point here, which is that people kind of really go after Bernie especially hard because he's a socialist or a
Hmm.
so-called socialist. And I drilled down and I spoke to a few socialists, and they basically said to me a couple things. First of all, when you're living in a fundamentally capitalist society, you can't expect people to just withdraw completely and become hunter-gatherers, right? This is an inherently exploitative society. We have to live in it. And as we're living in it, we're going to consume things. We could be self-righteous and say that this, that, or the other consumption choice is a fundamental way of exercising our moral conscience, and maybe it does have some benefits, and certainly in the case of a concerted boycott campaign, it could even move the policy needle. But there's also a kind of upscale liberalism that basically says that uh, the consumer choices are the primary thing that matters. That going to Whole Foods and buying certain organic products or driving a hybrid car or perhaps even drinking fair trade coffee or I don't know. I mean, maybe the union label is a little different, but that is basically the way society will transform. When in fact, socialists believe that because capitalism is inherently exploitative, and a handful of capitalists own the means of production and harness it to seize the profit from that, and workers don't have democracy and a choice in where the fruits of their labor go, then until you change those fundamental power dynamics, and that could be a very long, gradual process, then you are not really striking any kind of a blow against capitalism. You're not really furthering a socialist agenda. And I think another aspect of it is that if you do focus on those consumption choices, you could actually be feeding into a distraction.
Yeah, no,
And
I want to.
And you could also be entertaining something that's comfortable for upscale people who can sometimes afford to make those consumer choices.
Yeah, and I want to just jump in here because I think you've made a terrific point there, Daniel Marans, and I want to just emphasize it a little bit and maybe even drop one of the other stories we were going to talk about to do it, because I think this is so important. What comes to mind is there was a fascinating article recently, and I'm old enough to remember this, but in the 1970s, there were a series of television ads that showed a Native American, turned out not to be a Native American, and he's kind of canoeing through all sorts of debris and garbage, and nature is being ruined by people littering and so on. And at the end, it's a close-up and a tear falls from his eye. And these are very famous ads, considered very progressive ads. And it said, you know, people cause pollution, only people can stop it. And it turned out, according to this article, that it was the national product container industry behind these ads, and that they were paying for them intentionally so that people would get the idea that wasteful disposable product containers and wrappers were not that the pollution they were causing was not an industrial problem, much less a problem of capitalism, but that it was my fault and your fault and everyone's fault as an individual. They were enormously successful at it, and somehow I see your observation about Bernie and the code as being along the same lines, that if only people like Bernie bought, I don't know what the price point is that's acceptable, a $400 coat, then we wouldn't have inequality. You know, I mean, you can reduce it to absurdity pretty quickly, but isn't that pretty much an extension of or reflection of what you're saying?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I'm familiar with that ad, though I think I've seen it on YouTube and not actual TV. I mean, yeah, right. Focusing this on individual choices rather than social movements and structures that shape those choices, that make it harder for us to do certain things. It is actually a corporate strategy. It's a corporate marketing strategy that if only you buy this one other thing, or you don't buy this thing, in the case of what people seem to be saying about Bernie, then that will produce the social change that you need. And that's just fundamentally not the case. Look, there's a minor detail here, even in this story, which sort of makes it all the more ridiculous, which is that he received the coat as a gift from his stepson, who had worked for the Burton Company. And you know, I almost wish he had bought it on his own, though, because it would make my point more effectively. I mean, and you know, just to harp on this, I mean, to develop this a little more, rather, the things that democratic socialists and sort of economic progressives believe that we need to sort of change the way everything functions in American society is things like building a real labor movement, is things like organizing poor people into grassroots organizations if they're not members of labor unions, things like organizing tenants to fight eviction and homeowners to fight foreclosure. And yes, then from those movements, electing politicians that reflect those values. And then you can build power that would check capital, that would check industry in the case of pollution, and realign incentives. So I mean, these little trends are really a drop in the bucket, and as I said, in many cases out of reach for ordinary Americans who really just need to make the easiest choices they can to survive and feed themselves and provide for themselves. Now, the other aspect of this is that once we do achieve, you know, something like a socialist utopia, or you know, Sweden or something close to it, which is not again a socialist utopia, but it's a social democratic market economy. The the point is not that in that case Bernie would have to buy a $400 coat, or I mean maybe, but the the point is more to democratize access to these finer goods. Now, again, that might not be the most expensive coat, and it certainly wouldn't be the luxury car, but it would be a damn good coat if, I mean, if we divided our wealth more evenly in this country. you could imagine a situation, with a basic income or a job guarantee and strong labor unions where every American could theoretically afford a coat like that. And that's the sort of society that socialists told me they're looking to fight for. So it really, this idea of an ascetic ethos in socialism, I think it kind of actually confuses socialists for hippies, for lack of a better term. You know, with total respect for hippies, but those are folks that are almost more traditionalist and eschew material goods, whereas socialists are saying, no, material goods matter, and they dictate this kind of standard of living you're going to have, and we just want everybody to have access to a much higher basic standard of living.
We said we're socialists, not stoics. Uh, so unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but I think you're right. And I think also this is a way of people oversimplifying a point of view that may make them uncomfortable so that they don't have to address its implications. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I know you're off to do some reporting. So thanks for the great work. And Daniel Marans of the Huffington Post, thanks for coming on the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Richard.